Welcome to the next episode on catalyzing radical systemic change. Today, we will dive very deep into the weeds of mindfulness, and for whatever reason, meditation and mindfulness in my own biography dates back to my mid-adolescence. I started to meditate when I was 17, and I was always like fascinated by the power, what it can unleash when you're actually just sitting in silence. And throughout my studies, I kept on like meditating. I was sitting with Buddhist teachers, but also teachers from contemplative tradition, Christian teachers, and more exotic ones. And then I finally wrote my diploma thesis on the effects of long-term meditation on social behavior. And I'm really feeling honored today to be in the virtual space together with Jamie. And he just published a study, and what I find particularly interesting about the study, whereas normally you would think of like mindfulness and meditation connected to like stress reduction, but actually here it's really about the connection of like mindfulness and politics. And certainly me personally, I've never engaged in a deeper conversation about a topic linking mindfulness, meditation, and other techniques to politics. So thanks, Jamie, for making the time. And before we dive deeper into the study, I'm really curious, what is your personal link to mindfulness and meditation in your life?
Wow. Well, it was really lovely to hear about the beginning of your path when you were 17. And it's not often a part of my own journey that I tend to share when asked that question. But since you went that far back, I think I might do the same. I grew up in California for 2 or 3 years when I was quite young. I came back at the age of 10 or 11. But by the time I got to about 16, 17, maybe 15, 16, I was given a tape by my dad that he'd brought back from California. And it was a kind of new age meditation tape called the 5-minute supercharger, that he'd had, like, you know, gaining dust on a shelf somewhere. For some reason he thought I might appreciate it at the time. And although I only played it maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 times, that experience of closing my eyes, pressing play, and having a radically different, well, what felt radical, you know, at the time, having a radical effect on my inner landscape, and therefore on how I behaved after that. You know, like any other teenager, most teenagers, maybe not like yourself, if you were dedicated to it straight away, but I left it and didn't come back to it, but it planted a seed, you know. And that's what's quite interesting in the new trend for mindfulness in schools, that some kids get something that they pick up and they use all the time. It becomes a great resource for them through school, through exams, and others just had that little seed planted in the way that I did. And that was just like a visualization to make you feel energized or something. It didn't go that deep in terms of inquiring into your own mind, but I picked up the thread of that when I was in university. So when I was a fresher student, 18, 19, and it's been a big part of my life, or some part of my life, ever since. Just little by little, I would do as much as I had proof was valuable, and no more, because I was a bit ADD, a bit kind of like had other things, exciting things, you know, pubs and clubs to go to, activities to try. And it was really just the kind of like the hard won trial and error personal experience of like, wow, this stuff makes things easier and makes me more skillful. And I had to just little by little, over 20 plus years now, see that evidence for myself, dedicate more and more of my life to it, until it became, yeah, the main sort of pillar of my life, the main thrust of my professional life. And yeah, so trained to be a Buddhist meditation teacher over the last 5 years. Have been working in the public policy applications of mindfulness and compassion training for nearly 10 years, or at least I've been working in that area. So yeah, I could go on. There are a lot more sides to it than that, but
No, let's directly like ask into the field that we're starting to weave together. So preparing for the podcast, what I found particularly interesting, and also then represented by both the study and your work, is for whatever reason there was like almost a calling inside of yourself where you felt, me quote unquote, not being just a meditation teacher, but you felt like a different calling. So I'm curious, was there like a specific like aha moment or awakening where you said, oh, I'm going to start like the mindfulness initiative now?
Yeah. Yeah, so so you're referring to the conversation we're having on the kind of warm up for the call, where I said, yeah, I knew I wanted to contribute to the mindfulness sector, but I had a sense that there might be a role for me in a kind of the kind of meta level, like drawing together different parts of the sector, helping it to develop something that I had some kind of intuition about that. But the reason I wanted to contribute to widen access for people is because I had worked in a climate change campaign. And like many people back 12 years ago, I sort of joined that initiative, that climate change campaign, because I thought we could tell people more information and they would change their behavior, right? It's called the information deficit hypothesis. People just don't know enough. And if they knew enough, we'd all change our behavior. And I, like many others, realized that wasn't the case, that there was some missing thing here, that it wasn't just about the evidence. And I looked at my life and I thought, why did I suddenly start giving a damn? Because I certainly didn't through university and my early career. I liked people who were into that kind of thing. I perhaps wanted to be seen a bit like that, but I didn't really engage with the issues or take them seriously. In fact, I joined the advertising industry and thought that was the best thing for my efforts. But then went from being the black knight of consumerism to being a poacher turned gamekeeper, as we to use the phrase, and actually kind of doing the opposite. And I looked at my life and I thought, the reason I did that radical shift is because because of my mindfulness practice, because I became more aware, more awake, more sensitive, a greater sense of sort of care and curiosity about my experience and about other people and about how the world worked. I was cultivating some capacities that allowed the same facts to land differently. And so I was like, I've got to tell people about this. If this worked for me, maybe it'll work for many other people. And it was, I found out now, has been a missing piece for the whole sustainability sector. The theory and the science of how we get people to respond to the climate emergency completely lacked this inner dimension. So this intuition that I had was driven by the fact that I wasn't seeing anyone talk about this. So I wanted to do something to spread the word. I worked for Headspace initially for a couple of years before, through being at Headspace and getting some expertise in the field, I was then asked to contribute to this new initiative in the British Parliament. This is back in sort of 2013, 2014, when a member of Parliament and a member of the House of Lords invited the Oxford University Mindfulness Centre to start coming in and teaching politicians mindfulness and doing an 8-week course. And politicians became interested in the science behind what they learned and the policy implications for what they might be experiencing in their own personal life, this kind of transformation and change. And I was one of the volunteers and experts to come together to help them answer that question, like to present the science, to do a policy inquiry. So at that time, I was just one of the people in the Mindfulness Initiative, responsible for the criminal justice arm of this policy inquiry. But then I found like I really had an affinity for that, like it was really my thing, and ended up taking over as director of this organization, which has become now a kind of a solid like charity and a think tank, and have spent the last 8 years or so working in that area.
What I'm curious, so I have a couple of bullet points prepared, so we will run through them, but I always find it like way more interesting to follow the natural flow of the conversation. So from being part of that initiative and leading it, how do I imagine, because I mean, I'm in the field for many, many years, and I know like from beginners to intermediate to very advanced to, you know, kind of rock star level, you know, like meditation. But how do I imagine this getting like the mycelium building in the parliament, and then maybe in some other entities? So I'm just curious to listen into what you sense is happening there, because I mean 8 years is at the same time a long time and not. So what is happening there in Great Britain? And then also maybe riffing off of that from your side, like what do you see happening internationally? And are there also like differences, you know, from different cultures and nations?
Yeah, so back in 2014, we helped politicians to form an all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness. So this is politicians in different political parties across the spectrum coming together to, in many cases, practice together. There's like a weekly meditation group, and they even do silent retreat days together every 6 months or so. But they formed this all-party group to inquire into the policy implications, as I mentioned. But this became a kind of club, you know, like something for them to kind of coalesce around, because there's an all-party parliamentary group on many things, and any sort of potential area of mutual interest that politicians might want to come together and do, you know, research and advocate their views. It's a really lovely part of the parliamentary culture, and but this really took on a special dimension because it was this talking about stuff and doing, but also being. You know, you had the doing, thinking, and being all together, and politicians connecting at the level of their shared humanity. You know, like sharing things they might not otherwise share, developing relationships and a level of trust they say they haven't really experienced before. And they say there's an affinity amongst those who have been on this mindfulness course, and a more considered approach to exchanges of differing views, to a direct quote to a conservative politician, from a conservative politician. Or they say mindfulness helps us to disagree better. So about 300 or so politicians in the UK National Parliament have been on, you know, an 8-week mindfulness course. And some, I don't know, 50 or 60 of those might actually be practicing. regularly and made it a big part of their lives. Others have found a great insight from it and use little bits from it, right, without it becoming a kind of main pillar. And they've noticed over time that the culture amongst those who have had the training has shifted, and they have commented on how it helps to shift the overall field. They don't use the world of the language of fields, but that's basically what they've said. There's a halo effect. And when there's two people speaking in a more mindful and dare I say it, compassionate way, those who enter into conversation with them sort of like get affected, or like tune into that slightly different way of talking to each other and including more of themselves in the conversation. And so we launched this, the first ever policy report about mindfulness, that was looked at health, education, criminal justice, and the workplace in 2015. And by 2016, late 2016, 2017, they started. We continued the program of inquiry. We looked at new and different things. But by then, they started to really having an appetite to talk about, we talk about mindfulness being helpful out there, out in society, but what about mindfulness in here, in Parliament? Like, what does mindful politics look like? Again, a direct quote from a member of the House of Lords. And at a similar era, so 2015, 2017, the success of the mindfulness teaching program in the British Parliament and the policy program and the report that we created was inspired people in other national legislatures to want to do something similar. And so we kind of went on the road, like me and a member of Parliament called Chris Rowan. We had a kind of road show because of our physical characteristics. He called us the Laurel and Hardy of mindfulness, going around different parliaments, like France, like Netherlands, Estonia, European Parliament, and etc. And we helped to introduce mindfulness to 10 further parliaments, and in some cases it's gone really well. Like France is one of the ones which has gone from strength to strength. They've had many cohorts take an 8-week mindfulness course, we pulled together some of the politicians who are most interested in it into a meeting in the British Parliament. So we had 40 politicians from 14 different countries come together for a day of practice, well, actually a couple of days of practice and inquiry into the implications of what all this means for society. And we had John Kabat-Zinn come over, who's the professor who popularized mindfulness in the West through the kind of scientific clinical route, a great teacher as well. And he led a day of practice, and that was really something special. And we had people who like speakers from our different areas of policy inquiry come and speak to everyone there as well. And there was one particular guy who was a former prisoner, a reformed criminal, who spent a long time in prison, and he said he never really slept a night. And he was sort of really struggled to get a handle on his own mind and really struggled with impulsivity. And he said basically mindfulness gave him his life back. It was the thing that he needed in order to turn his life around. Like getting a handle on his own mind, being able to respond rather than react blindly, respond creatively rather than react blindly. And he presented to these politicians about what it made to his life. And like half of the room was in tears. It was such moving testimony, and a moving experience altogether. And so since then, we've held a international mindfulness in politics network for the advocates working in these different parliaments, doing some of the teaching or the policy stuff, and the politicians who are really interested in it as well. I've recently been working with academics in a couple of different research partnerships, and where we've hooked them up with some of our, in inverted commas, politicians, so they can conduct in-depth interviews into their experiences of mindfulness. I published an academic paper in 2019 or so, based on what I'd observed, like my own sort of anecdotal evidence about what I'd been told, which was powerful enough. But now we're starting to do much more sort of rigorous, standardized, semi-structured interviews, like categorizing the kind of benefits that they've found, and it's really encouraging what happens when you give people the framework to understand the cultivation of their inner lives, ways in which they can develop themselves and be the leaders that we need at this time.
So I have the feeling it's like a discussion like with a cornucopia, right? Because you're so deep into the field and so committed to it and since so many years. So what I'm curious to listen in is when I hear 40 plus politicians from 14 countries, if I rightly remember, so coming together, and this only started 2014, so less than a decade ago. I still remember school, so I'm 42. I still remember school just being like so super, like mega old school. And most of the people that have children, my ecosystem people tend to have children pretty late. They still say like school is pretty old school, but at the same time, I see like mindfulness in business and all these business schools and for like top managers. What would interest me is like from all these politicians and how policy is done, where do you see from the mycelium level of the people like meeting and having good intentions and having the discussions to influencing politics in their national jurisdictions, where do you see the first seedlings sprouting? So what is actually really like changing in the field? Could you give a couple of examples?
You mean like out in the sector as in society, like health?
In the school system, in the healthcare system, wherever.
Yeah, as I'll start with education because it's far from universal, or even super common, but it is certainly not rare to find a school seriously investing in mindfulness for their kids, and in the best examples having a kind of whole school approach. And there are different ways of doing it, of course. There's like teachers not really knowing anything about it, but knowing that they can just press play on the recording and everyone like practices together just for like 5 minutes at the beginning or whatever. And there are reasons why that's could be helpful. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have like head teachers saying, this is going to be a mindful school. We're going to have teachers trained up. We're going to have assemblies in a certain way. It's going to have an impact on how we are in all of our lessons, not just the kind of the mindfulness lesson, and in the UK, you have whole academy chains, which is sort of like networks of schools, saying that we're going to invest in this way for all of our schools, and so you have a thriving ecosystem of sort of service delivery organizations, training organizations who can come in, and in the best cases have a kind of support from outside trainers to train people up and be there to develop things and keep things, but where you have like internal resources within a school because teachers have really committed to it themselves, that they really want to do it. So you are seeing that. And in the UK, we've had some success in advocating to consecutive secretaries of state for education that mindfulness should be considered as a strategic priority, and they've conducted a program of research on mental health and mindfulness. So that's more of a It's up to individual schools. It's up to individual teachers who are being the change, and it's very much bottom up. Is what we've seen in the British education system. There are other examples in the US and other places where like whole boards have said that this is a priority, but it's still real a real mix. In healthcare, we see the strongest evidence, and for instance, the where it kind of initially came into the West in a clinical context, working with pain, long-term health conditions, some of the stuff that is people don't know how to work with, how to cure, that people have just got to live with, like that kind of thing as well, and common mental health conditions, depression, anxiety. The evidence is just getting stronger and stronger, and now the UK, which a lot of countries look to because they have a kind of national health system, but also this like independent body which like does these every 7 years, does these huge reviews of all the evidence and gives their authoritative guidelines about what should be spent on what. Other countries have similar things, but and mindfulness has been recommended since 2004. So this is 18 years ago was the first recommendation, and since then it's been strengthened for more types of depression, more conditions, and it's pretty much universal in terms of there'll be some mindfulness service within the health sector, which is one, as a policy institute who does all the research, makes the recommendations, goes to ministers of government and tries to advocate it. You never really know exactly. I mean, rarely do you know exactly it was your intervention that made the difference, but we're part of the ecosystem that's helped to bring that kind of thing about, because actually it's changed significantly in the last 8 years or so. And the final one that I'll mention is criminal justice, because that's really is one of those areas where actually our intervention was really demonstrably the thing that shifted the needle, because the Ministry of Justice here said, like, we are responding to your report, here's what we're going to do. They've done it over the course of 5 years. They've done the kind of sector-wide development, they've done the research, they've done the kind of curriculum inquiry, etc., to try and bring mindfulness into the prison system for prisoners, prison staff, and those who have left prison. But in reality, it's so difficult in a pandemic, under the conditions of like cuts, where the UK has been under cuts for like the last 10 years, and prisons in general, man. There's lots of amazing, well-meaning people. I don't just mean well-meaning, I mean like energetic, talented, committed people, all engaged in this kind of grassroots, largely bottom-up phenomenon of practitioners wanting to share it with others. But for the example of the prison system, like it's just so Victorian, like you're saying about schools being old school. Like the prison system, it's desperate. So for a lot of inmates, like a regular mindfulness class is a long way away still.
Thanks for sharing all the examples. So certainly I had already now pretty early in our conversation a lot of aha moments, and like perceiving like the ecosystem that you're part of like flourishing and being way more innovative than I would have thought. And I would consider myself like already pretty much like a fly on the wall, What I'm curious, before we start into diving into different parts of the study, is when you look at the study done and what you want to achieve with it, what was like the precursor? Like what made you want to do the study? Like why this study, right? And what are the effects that you want to see with the study done?
So are we talking about our most recent publication about
exactly.
the climate crisis? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I've sort of introduced the kind of the why for me personally. 12 years ago I left the climate world. and wanted to do something with mindfulness. That was my big aha, like I suddenly, from despondency to drive, I suddenly wanted to work in this field. And little by little, I worked my way here. And in the meantime, the evidence base has been developing to the point where we can actually make a report about this as well. So from working at Headspace to working in public policy, back then, 2014, we needed to do the review of this stuff. Was so weird and so fringe that even making a report about it, looking at health and stuff, where the evidence base is actually really quite credible and strong, it was such an unusual thing for politicians and policymakers to be talking about, that we had to do that really robust platform building, credibility building, like going to where the evidence was strongest and where the conversation was easiest, and that's, like I say, health, etc. And then it moved organically into political culture, and then in sort of 2016 or so, it became 17 again. It became clear that our dialogue with politicians and other decision makers was always limited to this little box that they had mindfulness in, or like it's just a kind of a solution, like many other solutions for a particular issue that they have. So, okay, for instance, there's 500,000 people at risk of recurrent depression in the UK. Depression might be, according to the World Health Organization, the greatest burden of disease on the planet quite soon. So politicians are aware of this. So we're in the room because we've got something that can help with their depression concerns, right? They don't care unless they're personal practitioners and they have the insight into, hang on, there's something else going on here. There's something more profound. Like they don't want, they're not thinking in those terms, right? Our conversation can only be about the percentage of reduction in the rates of depression. But some of the politicians who have actually practiced, and this is what makes our kind of policy advocacy research project within Parliament so different from all the others, is because it has this personal, intuitive component that goes beyond words. It's like they've touched something and they want to say that, but this is not just about 33% reduction in depression or 27% reduction in anxiety. There's something else here, and it manifests with them just wanting to apply it to everything, right? And there's evidence, and for lots of these different applications, that's not a problem, I don't think. People often dismiss mindfulness because it's applied to so many different things, therefore it must be oversold. It's applied to so many different things because it's foundational. Like it's a type of human awareness, which we all have capacity for. Like it's a natural capacity. Think of it in those terms, not as some program that some people do and others don't, not a practice that you can pick up and put down. This is a natural human capacity, and it is our innate ability to intentionally be aware of what's going on inside us and around us with a particular attitude of openness, curiosity, and care. And even if you've never heard the word mindfulness, you will be somewhat mindful some of the time, and you might gravitate towards activities which inculcate, which cultivate this quality in our heart minds. And when politicians and other influential advocates sense what this is, and they say, this is this important way of being I can cultivate, and I can turn towards the challenges I face, the people in my life. They get a sense that it's in some way foundational to everything that they do. And that's why there are so many, studies about this, that, and the other, and whatever. But we're missing the big picture, lost in all these little siloed benefits in these studies, because that's the way science works. They have expert researchers in a particular type of attention, or this particular type of depression, etc. And that's often the way policy making works as well. It's really siloed, fragmented. So it takes the more visionary and philosophical politicians, it takes a kind of synthesizer influence, like, you know, my organization and my work, to pull these little like constellations together, you know, and draw the lines in between all of these dots to show them a picture and say, you know, this is the big, you know, this is the bigger story we can tell. Mindfulness and compassion, as important capacities, natural capacities of mind and heart, are foundational to our health, our relationships, our performance, and ultimately how we work together to address the challenges of our times. So we started to get an inkling that we needed to break out of these really narrow narratives, and that the politicians we worked with wanted the language and the framework to be able to be more confident and say stuff about this rather than just have an intuition. And so we set out on basically a 5-year project to try and develop the narrative framework that can do that. And our first attempt at it was published in 2020. It was called Mindfulness: Developing Agency in Urgent Times. And that was about how mindfulness in particular can underpin our faculties of perception, understanding, and action to help us respond more wisely and appropriately. And in the last couple of years, we have looked at widening from, narrowing down from like the challenges of our times, which is what we're looking at in the agency document, to the climate crisis in particular, but also broadening out in another way, which is to bring in compassion as an explicit capacity. Until that point, we kind of like talked about compassion and care and empathy as a part of the kind of the mindfulness construct. But it got to a point of maturity in the conversation that we could start being explicit about compassion without a fear of it turning off too many people. You know what I mean? And so yeah, that's why we got, as well as it being a personal passion and just being so necessary, because the inner dimension of the climate crisis has been ignored, as I mentioned. We conducted a 18-month research partnership and writing partnership with Professor Christine Bamsler at the Lund University Center for Sustainability Studies, and that's how we got to the launch of our publication, Reconnection: Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, a couple of weeks ago.
Want to get a little bit like provocative. Although I agree with the underlying assumption that after so many COP meetings, just focusing on change on the outside and not that much happening should be blatantly obvious, right? That we need to develop inner capabilities. But nevertheless, I'm really curious from a scientific point of view, not saying that science is, there's also, you know, it's also the problem of science having like too much weight in our culture, I personally think. But like for the sake of the argument, like from a scientific point of view, how do you underpin the assumption that mindfulness as a capability, almost like a meta capability, needs to be developed in order to solve the climate crisis? What's the assumption with which you start the study?
Yeah, I mean, if we need to all practice mindfulness in order to solve the climate crisis, then we're pretty screwed. Like, I hope it isn't necessary. You know, I think the whole, for us all to have a personal practice and to develop mindfulness, I think it'd be enormously helpful. But the kind of timescales that we're looking at, you know, in order to get more than, say, a third of people practicing in the policy making space, in the influential decision makers of the world, and some proportion of the population, it's now 15-20% of people have tried mindfulness. It would be enormously helpful. So but we're not framing this as like the thing that's going to solve everything, or we can't solve it without this. However, I might say that we will struggle to to get out of this predicament, to transform in the way that we need to transform culturally, structurally, individually, collectively, unless we consider the inner dimension in all of the different ways in which that shows up, you know. So we've done research with Christine into what policymakers at different levels, this is like EU Parliament, Commission, UNFCCC, national legislatures, etc., expert policy advisors. You know, we interviewed them about the inner dimension of the climate crisis in general, building on a lot of work that Christine's already done by going to COPs and talking about this. And we're going to publish this as an academic paper in the next few months, and we found like 4 different categories of the way that the inner interacts with the climate crisis. One is that it's seen as the victim of the climate crisis, and this is what we're probably most familiar with. Politicians are anyway, increasingly aware that the youth have climate eco grief, anxiety, and depression in huge numbers. I mean, like the majority of people are finding a real drag factor on their well-being, sense of meaning, hope, etc., and really affecting the decisions in their lives. So that's one interaction. There's a one-way interaction in a lot of politicians' minds between, okay, the climate crisis is bad, it's making people upset. Some are starting to acknowledge actually the mind is a driver of the climate crisis. Like deep down, there is a way in which this isn't just a technical problem. That is a kind of like an accident. Oh, we're making climate change happen because of carbon emissions. That was a complete we didn't see this one coming, which we didn't, I guess. But the fact that we haven't solved it since we've known about it the last 70 years, that is and it sort of keeps on getting worse, are driven by sort of psychosocial patterns. So that's the kind of second category. There's like mind as a victim, mind as a driver, and then you have like mind as a barrier, like the ways in which our biases, like confirmation bias, for instance, wanting to, noticing information because it agrees with what you already think, driving polarization, which again acts as a barrier to meaningful action, and then the politicians and policymakers who get those other 3, they are starting to put that together into a vicious cycle. So that actually evidence is showing that poor well-being, poor happiness is a driver of unsustainable consumption, making things get worse, right? So that gives us the climate crisis, one of the things. The sense of alienation, like needing to fill the hole inside of ourselves by having kind of like external acquisition of material goods, driving the climate crisis, which is sort of driving a whole range of things that will destabilize our societies and just be terrifying in itself, and that can actually drive more consumption, more unsustainable behavior, more polarization. It's in this vicious cycle, and what has been termed a breakdown loop. But we can reverse that. Now we've started to have this conversation. Now we're starting to map the ways in which this is happening. We can turn this into a breakthrough loop. But in order to do that, we have to we have to look at the holistic picture of inner and outer in this one great system, and see ourselves as embedded in nature in order to do so. So our report, as well as interviewing these policymakers, we also did a wide consultation with over 70 of the experts working at the intersection between sustainability and inner transformation. And we picked up on how when you talk about this, what do you talk about? What language do you use? What frameworks do you use, etc. And there was a lot of variance. And that's one of the problems, is because if I was a policymaker who knew nothing about this, and I had all these different experts saying something about the inner, but in their own different language, their own different way, different framework, I wouldn't see the bigger picture, just be all this noise, right? But so that's kind of where we are on the whole, but it's changing, rapidly changing, while I've been working on this project. And part of our work actually is intentionally trying to speed that up, because the story that we want to tell, the story that is starting to get told more clearly, is that underlying the climate crisis is a relationship crisis, a human relationship crisis, and more specifically, it's a crisis of disconnection. So we are disconnected from each other, from the natural world, and also from ourselves. We are unaware of, a lot of the time, what's most important to us, our values. We're unaware of our bodies, our emotions, which interrelates with disconnection from each other, because actually body awareness is what helps us to be empathic with others. Actually, to understand others' emotions requires us to feel our own bodies. And we show in our document how all these different ways in which we can be disconnected have got worse over time, are interrelated. And fundamentally, these foundational capacities of mindfulness and compassion are enablers of reconnection. They're about awareness and connection in these different ways. Like I say, enormously helpful, but not, I'd say, 100% required, as long as the inner is considered. And, you know, of the evidence base, a third of it is about looking at the kind of what we can do about this inner dimension. About a third of it is about mindfulness. So, you know, it's got to be in there somewhere.
I mean, there's so many questions now. I have the feeling for the audience, it would be interesting to pick a couple of examples. So when I went through the study, what I find particularly interesting, also obviously knowing from my own practice, so I'm biased, right, is we are bombarded with information. Just take myself, right? I use social media consciously, but also being aware of like kind of being hacked, and then I lose, you know, some minutes just on a thread. And certainly my own daily practice is like an amazing filter. It, like, every morning I do it in the morning 2 times 20 minutes, so 40 minutes in total. It's like it's so refreshing. It's literally like, I don't know, you're almost like pressing a juice and then filtering it, and then, you know, all the particles that you don't need in the juice, just for the sake of the metaphor, get filtered out, and then you get this like juice diet. And when I look on this like high level of the headlines of the study, because I mean, you have so many amazing quotes from people all supporting this. Where do you see the most important acupuncture points? I always call it in my own language, because I have the feeling that the people, since the social dilemma, I don't know when they started it, like 2-3 years ago or so, like people are really aware that they're getting hacked, like those few, whatever, the lucky maybe 10 to 20% on the planet or so. So out of all these chapters, where do you see the biggest leverages? One, I think, is really this training people to become aware when their attention gets hacked. Right? But also, yeah, just also curious on other parts in society where you really think this will kick off.
Yeah, I mean, since you raised the attention regulation issue, you know, the attention is absolutely fundamental to who we are and what world is created by our minds. Like what we attend to becomes our world, and therefore, you know, we become in relation to that. It's the faculty which sort of binds together our other kind of cognitive and emotional functions, and yeah, renders our world for us. It's the foundation of our agency, our ability to choose and to act in line with our best interests, and we're really waking up to quite how valuable it is to ourselves as individuals, to be able to see, hear, relate to other people, to have some kind of relationship to ourselves, and to information in the world. So we're kind of like starting to wake up to its ineffable human value, because over the last couple of 100 years, the capitalist world has woken up to its value, like little by little. This isn't just totally new about social media, like it's been the job of newspapers to use threat stimuli to capture our attention and sell ads on the back of it, for a long time. But it's got so bad recently that we need this kind of...
I want to ask into that very particular thread, because I mean, just to quote you, when you say, I'm paraphrasing now, you said something like, being able to direct your attention is almost rendering your reality, because it's so at the core of what makes us human. And we both know that in the broader spectrum of mindfulness training, meditation, and other techniques, training your attention is just one part of the broader, ideally daily exercise. But it seems to be very much at the core of the workout, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could say a couple of words about that. In that, mindfulness is in part a form of attention training, and so can give us some edge in our battle to free ourselves and choose where our mind is versus Facebook or whoever is paying Facebook, or whatever your social media of choices. But that's just one form, one thing that you might be cultivating, and the word cultivation or familiarization are actually the better translations of the word meditation, better translations than the word meditation from the kind of Eastern traditions where a lot of this stuff was developed. So bhavana in Pali and Sanskrit, or I can't remember what the Tibetan word is now. Bhavana basically means to cultivate. And the Tibetan word for meditation is to become familiar with. So rather than this being a kind of like, meditation has this kind of like, for me anyway, has this kind of like doing reps in the gym type thing. There's a kind of like, or you're meditating on something. I don't know. It's got some strange connotations in the West, but meditation practice and the practices you learn on a mindfulness course will cultivate sort of three main categories of things. One is the attention, and what you might call not just being able to put your mind where you want it, but also developing a kind of unification of mind, a stability of mind, a kind of a feeling of being whole in a way. And that's the settling of the sediment in the water or in your juice, or taking out the sediment or whatever. That along with the settling and the regulation of our attention, there's a sense of sort of well-being and calm. That's just sort of one of three broad categories. Another category is, it isn't just having a particular type, like focused awareness or wide awareness or settled attention. It is also a certain quality. So we can practice to make it, for instance, a kindly attention, or a compassionate attention, or an equanimous attention, or a joyful attention. It's like drops of dye in a bathtub, that like you're doing these, you spend these minutes doing the practice, and you like drip by drip, and you can sit there and you can be absolutely beaming with joy, and that's really nice. But the effect is you take it through your life. These drops in the bathtub, they don't disappear entirely, and over time you are conditioning your inner landscape to be just more like I say, equanimous, joyful, kind and compassionate over time. And the third category of things you're cultivating or familiarizing yourself with is insight, is just seeing more clearly the way in which our mind gets caught up in distress, the mechanisms of distress, and the mechanisms of joy, happiness, flourishing, all of the good stuff as well. And yeah, you talk about mindfulness, the human capacity, and that has a particular definition. But on a mindfulness course, you get all of this stuff. You get like heart practices, and some people put in gratitude practices now, and it's a kind of different thing.
Let's do almost a parenthesis in the podcast, because it was not planned for that. But for anybody out there who has either never done anything with meditation or contemplation, or just very superficial, kind of like downloaded the app, tried it for a bit, like what would be your, if there's like one recommendation, like, or some recommendations, what would you recommend such a person? Because I still come from a generation where there was no market, right? I come from a 200,000 inhabitants town. There were exactly 2 yoga studios. I mean, that was it. I mean, you go to this or to that, right? And today you have like so many offers.
I mean, that's pretty good for most 200,000 person towns where I grew up. But
I just went to the one who was closer, and but since the market is so full, and like mindfulness also, as we both know, it has become a commodity. Is there like, again, like, just it can be just your personal opinion, is there just like one recommendation that you can broadly give and say, if you do this like 5-day or 10-day or 14-day course, then the likelihood of you having at least an impression, a gusto, an imprint, like that might even alter your change, like your life positively?
There's a lot I could say in answer to this question. There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of guidelines, and like you said, there's a lot of offerings. But there's something I'm feeling quite pragmatic today. And there's speaking of yoga studios, there's this kind of adage, which is the best gym in town is the one closest to your front door. Because it's like, what are you actually going to do? There are so many offerings, and if you pick something up and it's good enough and you get a sense, most things will give you a sense of what it's about. And then I'd say jump ship, shop around, but like do the thing that you're going to do because it fits in with your life. And that could be an app. There are great apps, and they can take you so far. Because for some people, depending on your job, actually app is the thing that you're going to be able to fit in, right? But for other people, actually being part of a group is so helpful. And yeah, if you can find a group and you can find a teacher that you can trust their creds, and it's near your front door, near enough your front door, that's really, it'd be worth investing in that. Like finding a community of practice, an 8-week course that is structured to be able to introduce you to it properly and give you a proper practice. One of the downsides with the apps is that you become someone who listens to short guided meditations, not someone who is a mindfulness practitioner who can take it in every moment of their life wherever they go and just drop into a meditation. And that could be fine initially, but to get the more profound benefits, you want to be an inquirer into your own mind, a cultivator of your own inner capacities, and be able to do that on the train, in the doctor's waiting room, walking down the street, in relationship, whilst you're talking to someone. And those things require a teacher really to sort of show you, I think, to show you how that really integrates properly in your life. And to also, in an ongoing way, having a teacher who can like spot when you've gone off the path a little bit, and to reorient. But that comes a little bit later, perhaps.
And how do you see the connection in between mindfulness and compassion? Again, it's a broad topic, but just for today's conversation, where would you situate compassion and mindfulness practice in the overall topic, like the overarching topic of today of like taking action, ultimately, as I always say, I mean, it's very Alistair to sometimes quote like the New Testament, but I don't care. I'm tattooed also with the New Testament, with all religions. So, you know, you will know them by their deeds. So I'm often saying, I don't care so much about what you think you are, or even what type of fancy spiritual practice you have, right? But ultimately, I care like how you behave, what you consume, how you treat your children, how
Proof of the pudding.
what's the job that you're doing. So now that we're having this underlying assumption of mindfulness, you know, being a core capacity at the center of us because it helps us to steer our attention, right? Where's the compassionate component coming into that mix?
And well, you've reminded me that I only really started getting going on that question about what's most fundamental here about how mindfulness can help us to do the deeds, to respond to our times. Just before I do answer your question about mindfulness and compassion, I just want to mention that our new report, Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out, is split into two sections, so two chapters. First chapter is sort of the fundamentals of connection, how these practices can sort of help in all times, and then there's a second chapter which is like looking about the issue of connection in the climate crisis, and there's one particular aspect of mindfulness which I think is super key, which some of your listeners might associate with the work of Ian McGilchrist, and that is what you might call the holistic intuitive mode of mind. The cognitive scientists don't necessarily make it a left-right brain difference like Ian McGilchrist does, but broadly there are sort of two modes of mind: verbal conceptual mode of mind, holistic intuitive mode of mind. One chunks things into fragments in order to logically manipulate them and sort of exploit the environment, and by which I mean our immediate environment, like solving puzzles and getting out what we want. And the other mode of mind is more about understanding rather than about exploitation, and is kind of seeing the woods from the trees. And this upregulates when we spend time in nature, and when we do mindfulness practice. In fact, mindfulness makes being in nature more effective. Being in nature makes mindfulness more practice more effective. Like, it's all a family, this kind of like wide open, intuitive, holistic mode of mind, and sort of mindfulness and nature connection. So I think that's probably the other thing I would say, like this is really key. Another thing to mention, actually, the documentary Tawai by Bruce Parry is a really great entry point into sort of inquiring into what this might be, why this might be important for sustainability and an ecological civilization. Anyway, I digress. Let's go back to mindfulness and compassion. So I've offered a definition of mindfulness already. It's the capacity to attend to what's going on in the here and now, in and around us, with openness, curiosity, and care. And compassion is, but this capacity to be mindful is considered kind of an umbrella capacity. Like it contains lots of other things, or associated with lots of other things. So it's got that allowing, that openness, the kind of what's called beginner's mind. It's got the attention regulation. It's got an embodiment, this really important embodiment capacity. It's got this sort of equanimity, or kind of like calm or balance in it as well. And similarly, compassion is thought of as a kind of an umbrella concept as well, because it requires us to understand the motives of others, have this sort of human social awareness, to understand what's kind of going on, to understand, to read the emotions of others, to have like emotional intelligence and empathy, to kind of care. But it is functionally, so it has all of these things within it, but the quality of it is functionally and neurologically different from empathy. This is the main thing I want to kind of say. Like, a different part of the brain lights up when we're feeling compassionate versus just empathic. And it has a qualitative difference. So empathic can be quite distressing when you're actually feeling and taking on someone else's distress. Compassion, however, is an energizing quality and actually quite pleasant. If you look at Mother Teresa's face walking through the slums of Calcutta, actually she's beaming in the face of great suffering, because she's in this sort of beautiful act of service, of wanting to respond, of doing the doing. But it makes her feel good, not in a sort of selfish way, but there's something intrinsically wholesome about the feeling of compassion. And therefore it's like a renewable resource. It's sustainable. And so, like mindfulness, it's a natural human capacity that can be cultivated intentionally, and there are training programs that do that. Most training programs actually have mindfulness in them, because you need that awareness, you need that kind of stability, you need to be able to put your mind where you want it, have that basic kind of core capacity of mindfulness, and have that sensitivity of the body and sensitivity to your own emotions and the emotions of others that will come with that. And then you move on, and empathy is one of the outcomes of mindfulness training, and partly because of that body awareness, but then it moves it a step further towards action, and sorry, a step further towards the kind of equanimity that allows you to tolerate the distress of others and tip it into this particular feeling of compassion. And it's like tasting an orange, or describing someone what an orange tastes like when they have never tasted it. You can do your best, right? But it's really tricky. If you do meditations and you can really discern the quality of compassion, you go, oh, this is compassion. Because before that, it's all a bit of a soup. There's empathy, and there's like reading other people's emotions, there's compassion, but to really tune into, in a deeply attentive, phenomenological way, the resonance and tone of compassion is a beautiful thing, and really helpful, because you can, in the moment, tune towards that rather than the empathic distress, for instance. So without mindfulness, compassion can slip into empathic distress, or it cannot arise in the first place, and it's sort of required. Without compassion, mindfulness may not deliver on the pro-social benefits that it is associated with. And also having self-compassion. Once you've become mindful of all of the trauma patterns you have, or of all of the difficulty that you're experiencing in relation to the climate grief or whatever, actually having self-compassion and compassion for others, and therefore forgiveness, are enormously important. So I will now I'm able to speak about both in the same breath whenever I can.
Thanks for the discernment. I also want to give a book recommendation that has very deeply influenced me, and was given to me actually by a Zen monk a long time back. Must have been 18 years or so, in my mid-20s. It's called Zen and War, and very interestingly sketches the deep mechanisms of how in Japan the same agnostic techniques, right, that taught the Buddha enlightenment, right, without the compassionate part, were teaching soldiers to become kamikaze pilots, and tens of thousands of people committing suicide at the same time when Japan was defeated, because this should not happen. So this discernment of yours to say mindfulness and compassion, I mean, we both know that since the ancient old scriptures, in Buddhism, they need to go hand in hand.
Two wings of a bird, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. One without the other, doesn't really make sense, Also, I would not recommend just the compassion part without the mindfulness part, right? It will be a very feely, lofty, drifty,
exactly.
I don't know what.
It can be a bit woolly, yeah.
You need that anchoring yourself in yourself, and then like
For
opening up
sure. A
again.
phrase I really like is sort of soft in front and strong in back. That actually
Ah,
the kind of backbone, rigor, diligence,
yeah.
discipline are all a really important part of this sort of inner transformation path. But then also is the self-care and the allowing and the softness and the receptivity, Yeah.
Two things. I want to touch on trauma, and then I have like a critical notion towards the end. So first the trauma piece, and I'm really only mentioning my own story to to add a little bit spice to the soup of our encounter. So I burned myself severely as a child. Out of that resulted post-traumatic stress disorder, yada yada, and it was not up until I already had like 10 to 15 years of like meditative and contemplative practice that I recognized I can have these deep states of oneness experiences and bliss and whatnot, but ultimately a lot of the trauma was still like ruling my lives, and especially the coping mechanisms that I was applying. So my understanding up until reading the paper, and I'm really curious on your thoughts of that. This also, when I do coach people or people just want a recommendation, I usually say, if you have done 20 years of meditation and you have not done any therapy,
Hmm.
do therapy or
Yeah.
family constellation work or couples counseling. If you have done only therapy, couples counseling, stuff like that,
Mm.
maybe it's time to meditate. So I see them almost like complementary. And when I look at the way that like brought me to where I am here, it's certainly, complementing this contemplative, meditative, mystical path. I would say I'm primarily a mystic with that path of like healing. So the waking up with the healing. And I'm just, when I was reading that quote that you brought up from Alvina Alamets,
Mm.
in the study, I'm just like curious. I'm curious less about precisely the answer from the study point of view, but more how do you see like trauma and contemplation meditation sitting together? Because
Mm.
I have the feeling it's more like complementary, like therapy and meditation, because I see too many people in my own surroundings, sometimes meditating for 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, but they're never working through their trauma, right?
Mm.
Because it just needs other interventions, another toolbox,
Mm.
another type of teacher, and usually whatever, an awakened Zen monk, right, has not even a sensitivity towards trauma. He
No.
might even be traumatized himself. So yeah, this is a very complex topic, but I would like to give this a couple of minutes and
I mean,
inquiring.
yeah, it's complex, interesting, and really important, and really common for it to be a major issue amongst people who are really dedicating themselves to the contemplative path and getting into some deep layers of stuff without, like you say, the support of therapists or particularly body centered therapies like somatic experiencing and things that have been developed to work with
Exactly. That
nervous system
was my
dysregulation.
major breakthrough, like
Yeah,
somatic experiencing.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And I'll share a personal anecdote that I had a traumatic social experience when I was about 13, and it led to there was kind of developmental trauma, like chronic stuff going on as well. Like when I say like trauma, I mean certainly nervous system dysregulation in a chronic way, leading up to a particular event, which was definitely traumatizing, leading to me for like a sort of fragmented personal story. What do you call that? Like episodic memory. So like repressed memories, fragmented, like part of my life was just like a bit lost in my memory, never looked back, that kind of thing. And completely sort of oblivious somehow that this was, the language of trauma wasn't there, of course, but thought I was super psychologically healthy, and that there was nothing I didn't talk about or I didn't look at. You know, like I was from a talky family. You know, we talked about our emotions. You know, so you know, it was amazing looking back. That was the case, and it was my first month-long meditation retreat. So you know, I've been practicing for a time, but this is my first time I've been away on a silent retreat for that long. And I kind of got into this territory in a way that yeah, was enormously helpful. But God, it would have been a lot easier if I had had the frameworks to understand that this was going to be something I had to work through, and that actually I need to include the body in this and not just sit in my mind and try and do jiu-jitsu on it, and integrate it with therapy, exactly as you say. And in the last 10 years or so, have used multiple modalities to work through stuff. And it's just such a bodily thing, you know. It's just I don't know if it's possible to meditate through it even your whole life, and if you wanted to, if you didn't have these other ways. So I completely agree with you. And for me, you know, it didn't come up in a mindfulness class. It didn't really come up in any of my previous meditation experience, although I had been on, you know, week-long retreats and, you know, not in the way that I did when I was on my month-long. But for some people, it comes up straight away. Like they close their eyes and they've been repressing their emotions or thoughts or bodily experience or something about their inner lives. For instance, it's just an example. But they go to a mindfulness class. Maybe they've been told to go there by an employer, and it's not really even totally under their own, you know, not their own choice. And they're told to close their eyes and then attend to their bodies. Maybe the teacher doesn't, you know, really understand about these things or know to give people different options and go like, you know, you can use the breath, but for some people that's a bit difficult. So if you can always come back to your feet, like there's this trend, thankfully, recently, as this started to become more understood, towards trauma sensitive mindfulness. So this is, and then there's a book called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness by David Treleaven, and a colleague of mine is working with him on a new one, a workbook for teachers, I think, or for participants, and it's really to acknowledge the fact that 70% of people have an adverse childhood experience that is probably leading to some level of nervous system dysregulation. So if you're one of those 30%, you know, great. If you're one of the rest of, if you're the rest of us, you know, you might not call it trauma, and it may, you know, maybe it wouldn't be right to call it trauma, but there's maybe some level of something trapped in your body in the way that there's still echoes of that difficult time or experience that was too much, too fast, or too soon for your your mind at that point. So yeah, there's evidence that mindfulness and compassion can be really helpful with trauma. In particular, if held appropriately, and when I say trauma in that context, I mean like serious trauma. I mean like PTSD, and the trauma of everyday life or nervous system dysregulation, you know, needs to be considered by teachers. And it's another example why the wild west of meditation teachers is you know, on the one hand, may a thousand flowers bloom, and it's great there are so many different approaches and people doing different things. On the other hand, if you're not part of the kind of science-based, mindfulness-informed world in which there's a profession and a dialogue and, you know, like continual professional development and etc., then you'll be completely unaware of all this stuff. And you'll be doing people a disservice by not having, you know, not having learned about it. So, yeah.
I think I would ask you a last question, and then out of all these beautiful quotes in the study, and also for the audience, I will post a link to the study in the written description of the podcast as well. I'm especially mentioning this because I personally find few studies accessible for quote unquote laymen. So really just for people that want to, say, hey, I have an hour, I kind of like read it through and I get a couple of insights. But this one, both from the, let's say, complexity of the language, it needs to be complex, but it's still like, it's like concise, the chapters are short, you're not drowning people in footnotes. So I want to recommend this study. My last question for us today, unless we're riffing off more here and there, but for today was, when you did this study and now the study done, and you basically starting a couple of like podcasts and wanting to influence people with that, what would be, in your own theory of change, like implications of this last study? What would you like to see happening in whatever, half a year, 2 years from now? So like I'm more asking you for the horizon 1 to 2.
Yeah, 1 to 2 years. Yeah, so this is a yeah. So we've created this as a policy report. So we've done a study, as I mentioned, interviews, consultation. We've got academic stuff coming out of that. But this report, although we did have an expert generalist in mind, or someone who's interested in in ideas in psychology and the climate crisis in mind as well, the report was written with a policymaker in mind, and we actually have recommendations at the end, which are like what we want to happen. What we want people in the European Commission or the British government, or wherever, to do. And in fact, there's also research funders and national institutions, transnational bodies that we include in our recommendations. Realistically, I don't see anyone. I don't see most of the recommendations being acted upon in the next 2 years, apart from, I hope, the innovation and research recommendations, because this is where we really need some more work. I think we can be brave and confident enough to get going and use public funds to start doing some some scaled programs in the general population or for political leaders right now, but we do need much more evidence building and innovation to create programs that specifically target sustainability and collective action, what you might call social mindfulness, that bring in the social container and the culture that we swim in, and use the kind of awareness and discernment that we can develop through mindfulness practice to examine not just the patterns of distress in our own personal psychology, but the patterns of distress in our culture and in our world. And there are some really great innovations that have been taking place over a number of years in this domain, like I say, called social mindfulness as a kind of category. And there are newer developments looking specifically at how we address the climate crisis. But this, hopefully in a couple of years' time, we'll have many more, and they will have well-funded research showing some of their effects. But fingers crossed.
So I've never ended a podcast with a quote, but there were so many beautiful quotes in the study. So I want to really read it and make this as my personal end, but feel warmly invited to also after that quote to maybe riff off the quote and make it your last words. It's a quote from Joanna Macy, an author, activist, and scholar of general systems theory and deep ecology. And it says, "The most remarkable feature of this historical moment on Earth is not that we are on the way to destroying the world. We've actually been on the way for quite a while. It is that we're beginning to wake up as from a millennia-long sleep to a whole new relationship to our world, to ourselves, and each other." Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, lovely to pick that out, Alistair. And quite a bit of synchronicity there, because I picked that out of the report in a meeting with the UN that I had today, because I'm a member of something called the Conscious Food Systems Alliance that the United Nations Development Programme has convened over the last year, and I've been working with them on a manifesto for what this Conscious Food Systems Alliance is all about. And when we're drafting our manifesto, which is all about the same theme as our report: connection, disconnection, reconnection, and developing a whole different mindset, whole different relationship with our home, planet Earth, and all of our systems. And I felt that quote, is where it's at, because it has this sense of, this is happening, this is already happening, it's coming together. Like, we haven't got to create this new world. This new world is emerging. Like, people from the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, who I was at a meeting with last year, to grassroots people working in the Amazon, who are part of this network. We're starting to talk about interbeing, and what a radically different world we can create with that paradigm, rather than our paradigm of individualism.
Thanks, Jamie. Very happy. And I have the feeling this podcast was more the kickoff of a deeper encounter.
Yeah, that would be
making
nice.
meaningful stuff happen. Thanks so much, Jamie.
Thanks you, man.